Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today with Amy Rebecca Gay. Stop giving in, say no, and create what you really want. We are going to start promptly, and I want to make sure that before we get going, you can navigate the webinar panel. So you'll have a webinar panel in front of you, and if it may look like the closed off webinar panel right here on the right, or the expanded version on the left. And either one of them, if you can move out of the way by clicking at the top of the webinar panel and dragging it out of the way. And you can also click on the orange arrow and open and expand the webinar panel so that it is smaller and not obstructing your screen. At the end of the webinar, we are going to have a questions and answer session, and we're also going to ask some questions along the way. And you can open the webinar panel by clicking on the gray arrow. That's right, exactly there where it says questions, and then you type in your questions in the blue rectangle right underneath. And so that's it for me, from Mickey Feldman-Simon, the founder of I'm Back at Work. And now I am going to turn off my video camera so you can concentrate on the presentation and pass it on to Amy.
Right. Well, hello to the I Am Back at Work community. I'm really excited to be here today. This is my first webinar, so it's sort of fun to step out and try something new, and I'm really excited about that. I am a coach, mediator, trainer, consultant. I do a lot of things around capacity building, both individually with groups and with organizations. And my area of specialty really is communication, leadership, and negotiation. Probably my passion is, how do you say what's really on your mind? How do you speak your truth in a way that also builds relationships, even when those might be difficult conversations, or in the case that we're going to be talking about today, when you have to say no? I think the more that we can all step up and show up and speak up, the better place our world will be, because we all have important things to say. I work with a wide variety of people, so coaches, senior leaders, managers. I have a number of coaching clients who are entrepreneurs, and basically anybody who wants to step out into the world and into their own unique leadership style and create some bold changes. So, and it's work that I really, really enjoy. And we are here today to talk about one of my favorite topics, how to say no and how to really say what's on your mind. Uncover that, figure that out, and really get that out there. So let me start with, turn off my camera here. Let's start with two stories. Mickey, that didn't work. There we go.
It's all good.
What was that?
It's all good.
Okay, good. We're going to start with two stories. Sheila and Kelly, whenever I talk about anybody in this webinar, I'll have changed their names or identifying features. But Sheila and Kelly are two people that I know and one person that I coach. Kelly is a stay-at-home mom who has a huge, huge heart. She can't say no, actually, to any kind of request, or to anything that anybody might need. So if you are home with a new baby, she's the person on your doorstep with dinner. If you're just coming home from the hospital and need some help, again, she's bringing the meal, or maybe she's the person who picked you up at the hospital and drove you home. Do you need a last-minute play date? Give her a call. She'll have your kids over at her house, take care of them, pick them up from school, drop them off, and really take them where they need to be. And this, at its foundation, really stems from, I think, a desire to be helpful and really a sense of liking people. But what happens is she's overloaded and doesn't have any time for herself, and there's sometimes these negative undertones that can overshadow her kindness. And I think that's because there's some anger and resentment over these lack of boundaries that she herself hasn't necessarily established. And so people know they can call her, so they do, and she doesn't say no. Sheila, on the other hand, she just actually had a baby just this month. She's a chemist and a senior manager at a really notable lab. And she's one of the senior managers, so she's got quite a bit on her plate. And as you can imagine, being a woman that high up in science, she's often the only woman in the meetings. And this will probably come as no surprise to all of you, she is always asked to take notes. And she doesn't want to take the notes. And her reasoning, as we've talked about it on the phone, has been, why should I always be the one who's taking notes? That takes a lot of extra time. It's a lot of responsibility. And I have just as much responsibility and just as much on my plate as each and every one of those men sitting there. Yet they expect that I'm the one who's going to be taking the notes. So I said, great, so why don't you just say no? She's like, well, how do I say no without getting labeled hard to work with? I don't want to be that woman in any way that people all of a sudden don't want to ask to work on projects because I become hard to work with. So she was really feeling stuck between how did she say no, but how did she say it in a way that she didn't get labeled or pigeonholed or labeled hard to work with. So what's happening for both of these women, and maybe you can relate to one, maybe you're the other, or both of them, they're giving away their time, they're giving away their power, and they're not having their own needs met. And underneath that, they're fueling their own anger and resentment. And so it's a little bit contradictory, but part of the approach that they're taking where they don't want to damage relationships actually winds up sabotaging them and their relationships in the end. So my question is, which one of them do you relate to? What about their stories can you connect with? Do you find a time when you've said yes and silently given in when you really, really wanted to say no? Or maybe you've said no, but the other person didn't seem to believe you, didn't take you seriously. Or you've tried to say no, but the words just get stuck and they don't come out. Or maybe the no has been so powerful and deep within you, it's come out and you've lashed out and you feel like you've just been wielding daggers. So all of these different behaviors that are really fueled by this not having a constructive way to say no and engage in this way actually are toxic for us and they're toxic for our relationship. So my hope here is that you can all take away some awareness. What are your defaults? How do you tend to respond? And then some tools and strategies for saying no effectively. And effectively here for me also means building your relationships so that you can carve out the time that you need, be strong in relationship to others, and then really create the life that you want. So let's dig in and see what we can do. I've built a lot of the presentation today on this book, which I really like. And if saying no is something that you're interested in, I encourage you picking it up. It's called The Power of a Positive No, How to Say No and Still Get to Yes. And it's written by William Ury. He was the second author on the book Getting to Yes, Negotiating, How to Negotiate, which you may have heard of. And so we're going to cover 4 different aspects here. First are the common traps. What are the things that you tend to do? Or that we all tend to do that aren't helpful and constructive and meet our interests. And then his formula for the positive no is really simple. It's yes, no, yes. So the first yes is your really deeper yes that your no protects, and we're going to talk about that. But how do you really root your no in actually your deepest underlying yes that you're trying to protect? And how do you empower your no when other people really push back? And then the final yes, respect, we just treat people with respect no matter what we're saying or how we're saying it. But the softer yes is there any room for problem solving? And we'll talk about that. Okay, so common traps. There are 3. Bill calls them the 3A traps. There's accommodate, attack, and avoid. And let's talk about each one. Accommodate. When we accommodate, we say yes when we want to say no. And what we wind up doing is we meet the other person's needs, but we don't meet our own needs. And here's the thing with all 3 of these common traps. There are times when they're appropriate and they meet our interests and times when they don't. And the point in my mind always is, how do you make a strategic choice to engage in the kind of behavior that meets your needs and serves you in a way that's strategic? And so there are times when meeting somebody else's needs but not your own is actually really appropriate. One example that came to mind for me is I was working on a design team with 4 other people, and we were creating a curriculum, a leadership curriculum for a corporate client in the Boston area. And we were going over the action plan, the draft action plan that was on the table. I thought it was great. And frankly, I really just wanted to give a check mark to this action plan and move on. I was over time that I had thought that I was going to spend on doing my design portion, and I was quite frankly ready to put a bow on it. And I thought it was great. One other person on our team really didn't think that it was great and really wanted to completely redesign it. And as I was sitting there, and the question was, like, how hard do I push back on this? And I hadn't worked with these people before, and the issue was clearly more important to my co-trainer than it was to me. And as she started talking, I realized she has a lot more experience designing these kinds of things than I do. And so I accommodated. I agreed to put some more time into it because first, it built some goodwill and some harmony with people I hadn't worked with before. The issue was clearly more important to her, and there was something that I could stand to learn because I didn't have a lot of experience designing this particular type of thing, and it really worked out to my benefit. The challenge is if you can habitually accommodate when it doesn't meet your needs, your ideas and concerns are not heard, and we can become angry and resentful. One of my coaching clients finds that she really accommodates her ex-husband's wishes, particularly around their daughter's care. And in their case, their daughter has some extreme special needs. She really needs to be with somebody 24/7 and can't be on her own. She's 9 and not verbal yet, and probably won't be verbal. And so the mother spends an awful lot of time with her and has a lot of insight into what the child needs. And the father is not living in the home and is working a lot. But she finds that she continually and habitually accommodates his interests, his needs, and his point of view, and not her own. And it has wound up poisoning in some ways their co-parenting relationship. And so part of the work we had to do with the coaching was to really figure out what was going on and find a way for her in a constructive way that felt good to really begin to assert her needs with her ex-husband and her point of view about what her child needed. So there are times when accommodating is a strategic choice and it meets you well, but again, this habitual accommodating can sometimes really get us into trouble, and we can really pay a big price. The next thing people tend to do the second day is to attack. So this is meeting our own needs, but at the other's expense. So think of it like a power move, right? That's not done particularly skillfully. And there are times when it's important, right, to really push back and push back firmly, whether it's a core need or a value is on the line, you really feel threatened. And maybe in that case, the relationship is less important. The example that came to mind for me is if you feel that your personal space is being infringed, right? The hand, a sharp, to stand back, moving out of the way. You don't necessarily care how it lands on the other person, but you have a need for your own space. Another thing that can feel like an attack for people is when we file a legal claim of some sort or go through formal processes within our organization. I did a recent mediation between a CEO and a senior vice president, and the senior vice president had filed a retaliation claim against the CEO. I'm going to make no claim here about whether or not that retaliation claim was legitimate or justified. I didn't have any access to that data. The legal investigation did turn up no signs of the legal standard of retaliation, but these two women still had to work together. And that filing of that formal complaint really felt like an attack. And there was a fair amount of relationship work that really needed to be done in order for the two of them to be able to come back together and continue their work. So attacking at times, there are times when we really do need to use the legal system, and that is entirely appropriate, and it can be very damaging in our relationship. So we want to use it sparingly and not just respond out of a knee-jerk reaction to anger in ways that can damage our relationships. Because for many of us, when we need to say no, we're actually in long-term relationships where the needs of the other person are important. And we still need to say no in a constructive way. The third trap that people fall into is that they avoid. And this is actually meeting neither party's needs. It doesn't meet your needs, it doesn't meet the other person's needs. Think of the ostrich putting his head into the sand, right? Like, I see nothing, I hear nothing. And maybe that's what we do, is we say nothing at all. And it's appropriate. There are times when it really works, right? So maybe people need to calm down and you need to resurface the issue when cooler heads can prevail. Or one of my coaching clients actively avoided his boss for several days because he had just been offered a promotion. And it was a promotion that he didn't want. And at the same time, he was in the process of negotiating a new job with another employer. And it didn't feel right to him to speak untruthfully to his current boss, right? So he didn't want to say yes, he was going to take the promotion when he figured he was really leaving. He didn't want to say no and decline it just in case the promotion fell, or the other job fell through. And he didn't want to disclose that he was looking for another job. So these other issues are more important, and he really needed some more time. So he actively avoided the situation for just a couple of days until he actually had a signed contract and had negotiated pay and had negotiated his vacation time. And in that case, it was appropriate and served his interest Because when he finally sat down with his current boss to talk about the promotion, he was able to be fully truthful and to say, I'm not going to take the promotion, I'm taking another job. And that's what felt right to him at that time. And again, it's the habitual avoidance, or the avoidance because you don't have the skills and ability to actually have an important conversation. And what we risk here is your input is not heard where your input is needed, and important decisions become made by default. So think, for example, if you've been at home with kids for 10 years, and in that 10 years, you've been doing 95% of all the housework, the dishes, the laundry, all the things that require the house to run, and then you go back to work full time. If you avoid the conversation about how to redistribute the housework and how others can begin to take on more responsibility, chances are that decision will be made by default, and it will default to, guess what, the status quo, where you do a full double shift, 40 hours a week at work, and 95% of all the housework, including the dishes, the laundry, the kids' doctor's appointments, and whatever else might be on your plate in really running a household. Maybe that works for you. And if that's what works for you, and that's the agreement that works for you and your spouse and your kids, that's great. For a lot of women, it might not work for. And the key is to not make that decision by default or because you don't feel you have the skills or the capacity to have the conversation, but to make sure that it is a strategic and empowered choice. So how do you get there? The first step is awareness. And it's really asking this question of yourself, like, well, what is my default? What do I tend to do? And so when do you accommodate? What are your biggest triggers for attacking? And what do you notice that you avoid? So take a moment in your questions place down there and just reflect. As you think back when you've needed to say no, what does tend to be your default?
We'll take a moment and wait for you to type in your comments. And the first one coming in is, I can relate, I attack my husband about doing his fair share of the housework. That's from Jenna.
Yes. And I think, I know as I think about my own behaviors, I have some people in my family, if I'm going to go on the attack, often it is within the family situation. And it's really important to just notice. So if that's what you're tending to do and that's part of your default, there's a conversation to be had there. First question is, what's going on for you? And then the next question is, how do you surface and raise that with your husband?
And Elizabeth is saying accommodate at work, attach at home, and need to avoid.
Sorry, what was that again?
I think accommodate at work, attack at home, and need to avoid.
Yes. So here's the other thing. We might not have just a single default, but we may have different defaults in different places. So as I said, I know for myself, I'm much more likely to attack. And at work, I have a couple of people I have to really keep my eye out for accommodating because I know that that can be my tendency. And our point here is not to judge. It is really simply to notice, because here's our first exercise. And it's really very simple. It is to simply take a breath in and a breath out and to notice what's going on for you. So the next time somebody asks you to do something and you find yourself about to say yes, take a breath in, take a breath out. You feel the desire to attack, breath in, breath out. You notice maybe you're equivocating. Oh, like you don't want to say yes, but you're not quite sure how to say no, and what are you going to do? Breath in and breath out. And maybe even in that breath, inserting a little bit of mindfulness, noticing your feet on the floor if you're standing, your seat in the chair if you're sitting. If you're on the phone up against your ear. And this pause, what it does is the breath actually first really begins to calm you. We know that when we are under stress, we tend to breathe much more in a shallow fashion and our heart rate increases. And so taking an intentional deeper breath has a calming effect. And then in that pause, it allows you that moment to recognize what's going on, to sense what your default is, and then to make a different choice. And through that noticing, you can begin to notice your patterns. And as you notice your patterns, those are the patterns that you can then begin to interrupt. And so this is really simple. It's just the beginning. It's just recognizing, and noticing in a non-judgmental way that gives you the space and the time to make an empowered choice. All right, so how do you know what that empowered choice might be? Because sometimes when I ask people, they're like, well, I don't know. We'll spend a little bit of time with that. And this is where we'll start with that empowered choice. What are your real deeper yeses? And here's Yuri's metaphor of the tree. You think the tree, this is yes, no, yes. We'll start from the bottom with the yes. And here's, notice the arrow going up. We'll then go to the empowered no, and then to respect plus problem solving. So first, here are your roots. And think of the tree roots really digging into the ground and providing stability. So this is what, for the tree, soaks up nutrients, moisture, hydration. It's really this deep yes, this deeper yes for you that your no is protecting. The trunk of the tree is what you need in order to stand tall when the winds begin to blow, right? When you say no and people aren't buying it and they begin to push back, you need to empower your no so that you can really stand tall. And then finally, all of these tree branches up here are respect plus problem solving. So the first step is really just respect out of the box no matter what. And then there's this question if problem solving might be appropriate. And we'll talk a little bit about that because sometimes it isn't. Sometimes the no is just sufficient and that's fine. Sometimes there are places to problem solve and that can be really helpful. All right. So root your no in your yes. My daughter, who's a quick story to illustrate this, my daughter plays soccer and she's the goalie. And at the level of play, she's 12 years old. At the level of play she's playing, the idea is that players really need to rotate through the whole field in order to build their skills. But the goalie on her team this year, the other goalie, broke her arm. And so my daughter wound up playing goalie for both halves, game after game after game. And while she loves goalie, she also felt that she was missing out on some of the development of playing midfield or offense. So she came up to me one day and she goes, Mom, I'm going to tell the coach I don't want to play goalie. And just being me, of course, I turned around and I said, great, then you can sit on the bench. Oh my gosh, like she took a step back, her big brown eyes got even bigger and browner. And I looked at her and I said, that's not what you want, is it? And she's like, no. So I said, don't tell me what you don't want, tell me what you do want. Right? And this is an old adage in negotiation. It's really hard to negotiate for what you don't want. It's hard to negotiate your no. It's much easier to actually negotiate what your yes is. So I said, well, what do you want? And she said, I really want to play midfield. I love midfield. I haven't played midfield in several games, and I want to develop that skill. And actually, I think I might even like to try to play striker, which is the offensive part of the team that scores goals. And I said, great. That's what you want to tell your coach. So it's a very different conversation, I think, for her to go up to her coach and say, Coach, I don't want to play goalie, versus, Coach, I enjoy playing goalie. I want to play goalie, but only for one half because I would also like experience on the midfield. I would also like experience playing offense. And so she's much more likely to be able to negotiate for what she wants because she's laid out what that is, right? She's laid out her yes. And so whenever I hear, I'll be in a mediation or training for negotiation, and I always hear one of my favorite mediation teachers saying, don't tell me what you don't want, tell me what it is you do want. And so it's this yes that is really what it is you do want. A challenge sometimes for us is to actually find that yes. What is that yes? What do I want? And here are two really quick and easy ways to find out what your yes is. And there are lots of ways, but these are really pretty simple and straightforward. The first is to listen to your emotions. So we often want to turn down our emotions because we equate having emotions with being emotional or being weak. But our emotions are actually a really tremendous source of energy and strength and knowledge. So when our logic brain gets stuck, which I think it often does, turning into our emotions and tuning in here can be a source of a really good source of knowledge. So if you're standing in front of that sink full of dishes, again, and you feel this wash of emotion coming over you, what's going on? What's that feeling? Are you angry? Because why must you wash every single dish in the house? Are you panicked? If you go back to work, like how on earth will the house be taken care of? Because you know the neighbors are going to wind up calling the health department, and they're probably right because nothing is going to get done. Or maybe you're experiencing fear. you love and respect your mother dearly, and she was a stay-at-home mom, and in your mind somehow this is how you are also supposed to take care of your family. But maybe it's not enough for you, and you're feeling conflicted about going back to work, even if just a little bit. And you're concerned that you're going to be abandoning those who you love most. Maybe your children will feel left to the wolves, and that just doesn't feel good to you. Maybe you're experiencing all three, or maybe something else. But the key is really digging into what those emotions are, because there's a lot of important information in there. And there's a lot of stuff that you can work with, right? So your yes then becomes fairness, for example. I'll just do one example here. But it's not no to doing the dishes, but it's a yes to saying that the housework should be distributed fairly among the family in ways that allow every family member to go out and pursue their passion, do what's important, and contribute financially. The next strategy is to continually ask yourself why. When you find that you want to say no, ask yourself why. So, and I picked this up from that leadership training I did with a person who wanted to redesign the action plan, and I'm stealing it because it's fantastic. It's called the 5 whys, and that's exactly it. It's all it is, just 5 whys. So let's say that you want to say no to getting the coffee for the meeting, for a job that you've just started. Well, why? Because you don't want to establish a precedent. Why don't you want to establish a precedent? Because you don't actually want to be seen as the barista, the person who gets coffee. You don't want to be the hostess with the mostest at work and at home. Well, why is that? Because even though you started in admin support, you don't necessarily want to stay here. Why don't you want to stay in administrative support? Well, you actually have some ambition, and you want to move up, you want to grow, you want to develop. You don't know how far this can go, but you want to see what you might be able to do. Well, why do you want to continue to grow and develop? Because you pride yourself on giving your best, and you really want to show up and see what it is you can do. And so your no is not saying no to serving coffee. Your no, what it actually is a yes to your future career, and a yes to you fully stepping into a role that expresses and rewards all that you are and all that you can contribute professionally. So what you're really doing is saying yes to your future you. And it's a whole important reframe that I think really opens up an awful lot for people. Okay, so once you've figured out what your yes is and you really wrote yourself down into your yes, you then need to distinguish between saying whether you're going to say no and how you're going to say no. And what happens is a lot of people conflate these, meaning because I don't know how to say no, I'm actually going to say yes. And you don't want to do that. That's where you start activating all those default responses and you don't meet your needs and interests. Whether you say, to figure out whether you want to say no, we've looked at a couple of these. What are your emotions? What's under there? Do the 5 whys. What are your values? And then ask yourself, what will happen if I say yes? Because the ironic thing is that we often are going to say yes thinking we're going to preserve the relationship and benefit the relationship, but we often, if we feel angry and resentful, we can wind up damaging the relationship. And to separate that question out from the how, what will I say and when will I say it? So if you've figured out at this point, you've rooted yourself in your yes, you've figured out that yes, you do want to say no. The next question is how, and how do you actually stay strong in the face of pushback? And this is where we're going to talk about empowering your no. All right, so to empower your no, the biggest source of power that I can share with you, there are a number of them, but I think this is one of the greatest single sources of power in negotiation, and that's Plan B. For anybody who's familiar with negotiation theory and concepts, this is also called your BATNA, or your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And basically what your Plan B is, you ask yourself the question, how can I meet my needs without the other person's cooperation? All right? And so you need to develop a strategy for that. So the Uris, for example, one of the impetuses for the book that Bill wrote was that his daughter was born with some significant special needs and spent her early years in and out of hospitals with surgery after surgery. And he and his wife often felt that the medical staff did not respect their boundaries for 3 a.m. temperature checks or unnecessary tests, or interns who were curious about what might be going on with their daughter. And they really felt that since they were living such an institutional life that they had to put some boundaries around it. And so their Plan B then, when they ask themselves how will they meet their needs without the other person's cooperation, maybe they could go to the head of the department, turn to the patient advocacy arm within the hospital, or seek out the ombudsman. Ombudsmans work within a number of organizations, but they resolve conflict just like this, and you bring a third party into the situation. Or remember Sheila, our chemist, who was asked to take notes. A way for her to develop a plan B could be to look to get transferred to another project, or even look for another job. Really important thing about being a plan B for you to know is that your options, your alternatives are not necessarily attractive, right? So you can say, well, that's a little unrealistic. Could Sheila really get transferred to another project, or would she really look for another job? And here's the important key. It's not necessarily that the alternative is attractive to you, but it's the fact that you have it that actually begins to shift the power. So if you believe that you are totally dependent on the other person's cooperation to have your needs met, you effectively turn yourself into a hostage. And when you feel like you're a hostage, you're much more likely to accommodate or to attack. And so one of the biggest benefits of having a plan B is the psychological freedom to say no. And having that psychological freedom gives you strength. And that strength means that you're not dependent. Ironically means that they're much more likely to go along with your no. So your plan B is an incredible source of power, even if that plan is not enticing. So if that plan is not enticing, and you don't really like plan B, your next task is to strengthen plan B. And you strengthen plan B to figure out first, maybe, how can you do it yourself? Can you exit the relationship altogether, or can you involve a third party? And these are just sort of 3 things that you might be able to do. Just given looking at the time, I'm going to skip the story for doing it yourself. But exiting for Sheila would be looking for a new job, and involving a third party for the Uris would be bringing in, let's say, a department head or somebody within the hospital like the ombudsman who can help broker an agreement for them. So I always advise, whenever I'm working with anybody on negotiation, one of my first questions is like, well, what are you going to do if they don't cooperate? And it's really important, if it's an important no for you, an important negotiation, to spend some time figuring out what is your plan B and how can you make it stronger. Because remember, even if the alternative isn't desirable, it still gives you power nonetheless. And then finally, what's your softer yes? It's respect plus problem solving. So there should always be respect. And the respect here, too, just to keep in mind, we don't respect other people because of what they do or what they don't do, what they say or what they don't say. We respect them because of who we are, ourselves, and because we respect ourselves. And so, respect is like anything else, right? It starts at home. It starts with you. It starts inside. And I think by going through these steps that we've talked about, right, rooting yourself in your yes, figuring out how you can meet your needs without the other person's cooperation is a fundamental part of saying my needs matter, and I have respect for myself, and I have respect for my needs, and I'm going to be respectful of you as well. And I think that goes without saying, no matter how the conversation goes. And it can also be really helpful to listen to the other person and acknowledge their point of view. Here it's important, the listening to understand. Often when we listen to other people, we listen so that we can craft the perfect rebuttal and so that we know how to respond. And in fact, maybe we even tune out what they're saying and figure out, while they're talking, what our next step is going to be. But when you're getting significant pushback from somebody because you've just asserted yourself, spending some time listening and figuring out what they're truly saying and acknowledging their point of view can go a long way towards helping you to stand strong and helping them to also see and understand where you're coming from. So here's another important point, something I run up against all the time when I ask someone like what might be going on for the other person and what's valid about what they're saying. To understand and to acknowledge what's valid for them doesn't mean that you understand or that you're going to give in, right? So you can say it's a struggle to find people to staff the concession stand on a Saturday night, or it's a lot of work to look for another babysitter. If you're going to say, let's say, no to an adult child who's asked you to babysit, you don't necessarily need to agree with them, but just to show them that you understand their point of view. And then finally, do you problem solve? And is this appropriate? So there are times when you just need to say no, and it's a no, full stop, end of story. It's the shortest complete sentence in the English language, and if that's where you need to stop, I think that's totally appropriate. There are times, though, when we're also in relationships where the other person's needs and interests are important to them. So what can you do? The first is, if you don't like what they're asking you to do, is to make a counter proposal. So let's say your adult child has asked you to watch your children on one particular weekend. Well, if you can't watch their kids that weekend, or your grandchildren that weekend, maybe you can do it the next weekend. Or if you can't staff the concession stand for 2 hours on Saturday evening, maybe you can make a donation. If you can't stay late tonight to finish a project, maybe you can make some time in your schedule tomorrow to help move things along, right? What is it that you can do, and offer that instead. The second is to name your terms. So an example might be, if you're not able to commute in 5 days a week, every week, maybe you can commute in 4 days a week. Or maybe you can commute in, I don't know, X number of days over the course of the month, right? But what are the terms that you're willing to agree to? And finally, if a counter proposal or some terms for you are not necessarily clear because the situation is far more complex, suggest a process for solving the problems. So maybe you say, given the deliverables that my team has been committed to, we're not able to meet the deadlines that you're laying out, but let's actually get a few key people in the department together and figure out what resources we can leverage so that we can make sure that your clients' needs are met and that we as a firm deliver a quality product, right? So you're proposing how it is you are going to find a solution without necessarily agreeing to a deliverable schedule that you can't follow through on. And I think it's important to note here that I'm not necessarily talking about compromise, splitting the difference, meaning like giving up half of what's important to you. Sometimes that's appropriate, again, a strategic and empowered choice, but sometimes you really need to protect that no and look for other ways to meet that person's need. Okay, so there are some quick steps and strategies I hope that you'll find helpful. And I just wanted to end with my favorite quote from Thomas Hubel. It's my favorite quote at the moment. And that is, the world doesn't need your help, it needs your passion. And I think we all are, I think our deepest yes is actually some of our deepest passion. And so what do we need to say no to in our lives so that we can really fully uncover our deepest passion and create the space and the fertile ground for that to grow and develop and really bloom? And in the process of that, to let go of whatever anger and resentment of overcommitment and feeling fenced in by others that we might experience, so that our passion can really come to life. And so what I want to ask you is, what's your passion? And what do you need to say no to in order for that passion to be really fully born and expressed in this world? And that's a wrap. I feel like I've covered some stuff at breakneck speed. So if anybody has any other questions or would like to talk some more, I'm available. Here's how you can reach out and actually contact me. If I can, I'd love to meet people in person for coffee if that's feasible. But if not, I'm also happy to follow up on the phone. So Mickey, you notice I'm a few minutes over. I apologize. I will turn it back.
That was a great webinar, Amy. So thank you very much. And we do have some comments and questions. So Lisa says, thank you for the tools to negotiate what I really want. Very helpful. And Laurel is asking, how do you deal with people who their response is always avoidance or attack?
So that's a good one. So I think sometimes trying to figure out what might be going on for them, and that might not be clear for you. And so one of my first steps when that occurs, when that happens for me, is to make transparent what the dynamic looks like. And I want to be careful about not assuming I know what's going on for the other person, because once I find myself in that space, I'm almost always wrong. But to just say, it might sound something like, I raised what I think is a difficult issue for both of us the other day and asked to have a conversation about it. And I've noticed that a couple of days have gone by and we still haven't gotten around to talking about it. And it feels to me, right, so I'm owning my interpretation, it feels to me like we're avoiding talking about it. I'm wondering what might be going on for you. And so you get curious about what's going on for the other person. And the same for attack. It might be, you know, in the meeting the other day as we were having a conversation, when you said blah, 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 it felt very much to me like an attack. And I found myself going on the defensive. And I just wanted to know what's going on for you in that moment. And, you know, what were you thinking and feeling, or what was happening? And so you want to get curious about the other person's behavior so that you can begin to understand what they're trying to accomplish and what they're doing, and open, this is called a meta-negotiation, opening a conversation to talk about how you're talking.
Right. And I'd like to add to that as well that I think it's always good to think if those are the reactions we are creating in them, maybe we ask the question in a certain way that, or have we asked them to do something many times and that is why we're getting the response we're getting. So to put ourselves in that situation as well.
Yeah, so if you ask like them, right, what's going on, maybe they say, well, I feel like that's the 17th time you've asked me to do something. You're like, oh, okay, so there's some interesting information, right?
Right. Well, we have no more questions, and I feel like this has been a great webinar. Thank you, Amy, and all our audience. I hope you join us in our upcoming webinars. So thanks, everybody, for joining us today.
Great. Thank you very much, Mickey, and I hope to hear from some of you.